there's a pretty substantial consensus about the positive impacts of the EU membership in general on the UK economy. There's also a very strong consensus among economists in general on the relatively benign effects of free movement and the resulting immigration on the UK economy. There is a lot of evidence on the impact of free movement on the UK labour market, and the evidence is broadly that there is essentially no negative impact on the employment prospects of British workers resulting from immigration from EU states. And while there may be some relatively small negative impact on wages for the low paid, that is outweighed by the overall beneficial economic impacts. I might say a bit more about that at the end. But I'm not going to say much more about the sort of retrospective of economics about what free movement and immigration in general has done for the UK so far, except to note that there is a pretty strong consensus that it is positive. What I'm going to say is much more practical about what Brexit is likely to mean for the UK immigration system, both in the short and medium term, and what in turn broader impacts that will have on business, on society, and on the UK. And I'm going to talk about three aspects. The first is what happens in the short term. And by the short term, I mean before we actually Brexit. In other words, before anything actually happens to UK law and policy. And what I think is quite likely is actually that we are going to see quite a significant fall in migration to the UK in the short term, for a number of reasons. We'll find out a bit more about this actually just a week from today when we have the next set of immigration statistics from the Office for National Statistics. And I think we might begin to see some signs of a fall, although it's early days yet. Why do I think immigration is going to fall? A bunch of reasons. First of all, the UK economy is going to slow at the same time as European the labour markets of other European member states are picking up. Since economics drives migration, labour markets drive migration to a significant extent, that will have some impact. The pound has fallen very sharply since Brexit by about 15%. That means people who come here comparing their wages with what they could get back home will find the UK considerably less attractive. And then there are, of course, psychological reasons. People coming here, of course, there's been a certain amount of hate crime and racism, but more broadly, people are likely to feel less welcome, less secure here, less likely to want to make their futures here, and that in turn will both reduce migration to the UK, but also may mean that some people who are here already from other European countries may choose to go home. So I think we will get some of the Brexit-induced reductions in migration coming through even before anything actually happens in terms of UK law or policy. And indeed, the Office of Budget Responsibility yesterday recognised that in its forecast, about which I'll say a bit more at the end. So that's the first point. The second point I'd like to make is about the legal position of European Union citizens who are currently resident here. And this really is a very, very big deal. There are about 3 million European Union nationals currently resident in the UK. There has been a certain amount of political noise about this, saying, well, we should say that those people are welcome to stay, even if we're not going to welcome future migrants from the European Union. The government has resisted that, saying that that's all going to be part of the negotiations. And it will depend on what other European Union states say about our nationals currently resident there. My expectation is that a political deal on this is actually reasonably feasible. It's one of the easier elements of the negotiations, and there will be some sort of broad reciprocal agreement that people here can stay. Unfortunately, however, and this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of individuals and businesses, it is not that simple. In fact, it's nowhere near that simple. These 3 million people, we don't know who they are. We don't know we really know nothing about them. Why is that? The 3 million figure comes from it's a survey-based estimate. It's based on a survey of 100,000 people resident in the country or so. And on that basis, we guesstimate there are 3 million EU nationals. But we don't know. There is no population register in this country. We do not record fully people coming into or out of the country. Suppose we said everybody who was here on June 23rd could stay. Well, I wasn't here on June 23rd. A number of people in this hall weren't. Equally, if we said that, then the Spanish schoolboy who was here to spend a week in London seeing the sights would be given permanent rights to reside here, whereas the Polish shopkeeper who's lived here 15 years would have to go home. That is not going to work. We will have to establish law, guidelines, administrative processes, registration processes, and so on. We do this at the moment for non-EU citizens. It's a form that's about 37 pages long. Lots of people get rejected. Lots of people can't prove that they were here at the right time, that they were filling in the right forms and the rest of it. The idea that we're going to be doing this for 3 million EU citizens when the Home Office bureaucracy can't even cope with the current president's under is pure fantasy. And government has only just begun to grapple with this problem. So what will happen? Well, in the end, bureaucracies do manage. We will create a bureaucracy to deal with this one way or the other. We'll have to, because there's no choice. But what I can say for certain is that there will be lots and lots of hard cases. I worked in the Department of Work and Pensions for a long time. That deals obviously with pensions and benefits for most, child benefit, basically for everybody in this country. Any bureaucratic system that deals with millions of people generates lots of hard cases, and lots of people fall on the wrong side of the line. What do I mean by that? I mean that some people who deserve to get help don't get it, and some people who don't deserve it do. The same thing will happen here. We will end up letting people stay who we don't want, some criminals, some layabouts, all the rest of it. We'll give them citizenship. The Daily Mail and the Express aren't going to like that. At the same time, some perfectly law-abiding, respectable people will be kicked out of the country for no reason except that they couldn't prove that they were here for the right length of time. That is how systems like this work. This is not a political decision. This is an inevitable consequence of Brexit. And it's not going to be very pretty when it happens. So, third thing, what will a new system look like? We don't know yet, but I think the Prime Minister said in her Conservative Party conference system that we didn't leave the European Union in order to allow Europe to continue to control our immigration system, and we didn't leave the European Union in order to remain under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. That means, if you take it literally, that there is no prospect of free movement remaining, that we will control the system. But that said, there is still a huge range of possibilities, and those possibilities run broadly along two dimensions, not one. Dimension one is the extent to which we give preference to European citizens. So at one end of the spectrum, we could have a completely non-discriminatory system, as Vote Leave put it. That is, we treat Europeans and non-Europeans exactly the same. They have to go through the same procedures, the same rules, and so on. At the other end of the spectrum is a system that's not free movement, that we still control, but still retains a very considerable degree of preference. We have special quotas, special relatively light touch arrangements for Europeans, in contrast to what we apply to non-Europeans. And the second dimension, which is related but actually separate, is the extent to which either of those type of systems is relatively liberal, letting quite a lot of people in, or relatively restrictive. You could have a non-discriminatory system that's actually relatively liberal, like Australia or Canada, or you could have one that was very restrictive, that was designed to get us down to the tens of thousands. Equally, you could have a system that discriminated in favour of Europeans, that gave actually, that although it was under our control, still essentially looked quite like free movement does now, that say let people in as long as they had a job offer. Equally, you could have a system that gave some preference to European citizens, but still had very tight controls and quotas. And we have no idea at the moment where the government will be on that spectrum. So, given that uncertainty, what can we actually say substantively about the impacts of such a system? I'd make a couple of points which I think apply in general, whichever way we go. The first is, and this is very important, that ending free movement is not primarily about border control. A lot of people think this is about controlling our borders. It just isn't. That is just wrong. We do not control immigration from Americans or Australians or Canadians at the border. We let them in, with the exception of undesirables, criminal, security risks, which are a tiny, tiny percentage of those people who arrive at the border. They are allowed through passport control routinely. The same will happen to French people and Italians and Poles after Brexit. Free movement will be controlled the same, free movement, meaning free movement of workers, will be controlled the same way it is for Australians and Americans, that is in the workplace. Employers will have to decide whether or not a European has the right to work. And that is going to be incredibly complex for the same reason that I just said about the 3 million, because we won't know. A lot of Europeans will already be here. They'll be given this right to permanent residence. Equally, a lot will still be coming in on new tourist visas. So one inevitable consequence of free movement will be a huge increase in the administrative burden on employers, a substantial increase in bureaucracy, and a substantial increase in the enforcement resources that will need to be devoted to it by the Home Office and other agencies. Anybody who thinks Brexit is going to lead to a shrinking of the size of the state or regulation is delusional. And again, this is not, as Thomas said, this is not a comment about the pros and cons of Brexit in general. This is just a fact. The second point, and this is a more economic one, is that there is a view that the UK, by ending free movement, will somehow be able to say, we'll only have the people we want, we'll only have skilled workers, and we'll have no unskilled workers. That there is some truth in that. A more controlled system will, ending free movement and having some system where people have to apply and have qualifications will give us more control. But it will not deliver that sort of binary outcome that people think, for two reasons. One is that selecting people, we don't centrally plan the labour market in this country. No advanced democratic market economy does. Systems are inevitably fallible, usually quite fallible. You can look at the Australian or Canadian one to see plenty of evidence of that. The same will be true of any system we introduce. More fundamentally, of course, we don't choose migrants, they choose us. And at least initially, I would expect the largest impact of Brexit on migration to be a reduction in the number of skilled workers who want to come here. And we've already seen that to some extent in the university and financial sector. So the view that we are going to substantially improve the skilled mix of migration from the UK is it's possible, but it's not going to be as easy. So finally, what are the economic impacts of all of this? We don't know yet. The OBR did have a go at this in its in the forecast that it released yesterday. It said that the reductions in migration that it estimated would result from Brexit would knock about 0.2 to 0.3% off trend growth. That's about 3% off growth by 2030, comparable to the sort of estimates that Thomas was putting up there. I think that might actually be rather low, and just a brief plug, I will be publishing some research that I and colleagues at NISA are doing on this topic in the next couple of weeks. I actually disagree a little bit with Thomas, who said that the main impact of Brexit on the economy would come through trade. I suspect we will actually find that the impact of the economy through changes to immigration policy may be comparable to the impact of trade, but we'll see. Thank you.